Very pleased to welcome Dr. Carol Hay. She's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. She works on issues, sorry, I'm like admitting people from the waiting room and doing the introduction. It's all a lot.
Zoom life.
My bad. So she works on issues in analytic feminism, liberal social and political philosophy, oppression studies, Kantian ethics, and the philosophy of sex and love. She's a prize-winning author in political philosophy, and her public philosophy has been published in the New York Times and the Boston Globe, among others. She's here today to talk with us about her latest work, Think Like a Feminist, the philosophy behind the revolution. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Hay.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, for setting this up. This is actually not the first talk that I've given at Marist, but it's the first talk I've given at Marist. Well, not at Marist, so something new. Yeah, I was actually gave a talk to you all several years ago, and I'm happy to be back, so thank you for having me. And I'm here today to talk to you about this. I recently published a book called Think Like a Feminist, and this book is not written for philosophers or even academics. This book is written for regular people. And it's been a really interesting process to write something just for ordinary folks. And so what I'm going to do today is just kind of talk you through some of the major issues that I discuss in the book and some of the motivations I had for writing the book. But mostly what I want to do is just hear your thoughts, hear your questions about the role of feminism now, how we got here, where we see it going, how we see it being useful. I think given the rather upended state of the world, feminism is probably as relevant as ever. And I'm pleased to have been able to write something that I think hopefully will speak to people and hopefully will give people the tools they need to think through some of the massive social shifts where we find ourselves living through. So yeah, with that, I think I'm just gonna go. And I'm probably gonna read you a short excerpt from the book, but mostly I'll just natter at you. Okay, and I'm also gonna drink tea because it's cold in here. Okay, so I wrote Think Like a Feminist in part because I think I've been spending at this point like nigh on 20 years teaching feminist theory in a wide variety of situations. And I came to realize that there are a lot of misconceptions about what feminism amounts to, like a lot, right? I like to joke that if I had $1 for every time I heard someone say, I'm not a feminist, but, and then go on to say a bunch of feminist things, I could like single-handedly close the wage gap, just like by myself, right? And so I realized it's probably, it would be useful to have a kind of like go-to resource that people could read, whether they themselves identified as a feminist or whether they were skeptical about feminism or curious about feminism, maybe in the wake of the Me Too movement and things like that, or the Women's March, these sorts of big social shifts we find ourselves living through. And so that's what this book is for. It's not written for academics, it's written for regular people. And it's meant to be readable, it's meant to be light. So it's a serious subject matter, but that doesn't mean it can't be fun to read, or at least that was my goal. So I've been telling people that I fought tooth and nail with my wonderful editor, Amy Cherry at Norton, so that she would let me swear, like just a little bit, because I feel like some of these ideas you just cannot articulate unless you could drop an F-bomb or two. So there's some swearing in here, and there's a lot of jokes in here, right? Basically, I feel like a stand-up comedian who spent 20 years figuring out which jokes fly and which ones don't in front of so many classrooms of students. So the poor things, they had to put up with this stuff. So I think what I'll do first is talk you through a very, very quick potted history of the feminist movement, where it came from. And then I want to move on to talk about some stereotypes that exist of feminism, stereotypes that they're sort of like the first thing that pop into people's heads when they hear the F word. And then if we have time, or we can maybe even do this in the Q&A. I want to talk about some of the central arguments in some of the central chapters where I talk about feminist advances in thinking about sex and gender, and how if we properly understand the evolution of feminist thinking on these issues, it becomes clear that what is sometimes called the turf wars, right? The idea that we should be arguing about whether trans women count as women or whether trans women should be properly included within the feminist movement, how these arguments very clearly are decided in favor of those who want to include trans women in feminism. So we'll see if I can get through all of that in 30 minutes, and if not, you can just ask me questions in the Q&A. Okay, all right. So basically, feminism, the way most people carve it up, has arisen in waves. And there's this wave metaphor that basically all feminists kind of agree on and all feminists kind of hate, right? This idea that the history of feminism can be explained in terms of these waves. And so before I even give you the history, I'm going to give you a big caveat about why this history needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And the basic concern here is that if you think about, if we think about this history as coming in waves, then we're possibly inclined to think of the successes of the first wave as being done and then being replaced by the goal and the projects of the second wave. And then once those are done, then now we're in the third wave. So the concern is that we think that the first two waves are over all across the world. And of course, we know that's not true, right? So these battles are actually still being fought across the planet. And there's a lot of backsliding. I like to say that this history is sort of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of history, where like many sort of like liberatory social movements, right? Progress happens sometimes in fits and starts, and then we have these long periods of stagnation or even backsliding. And again, we need to kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about the wave metaphor. Okay. But with that in mind, this is basically how it goes. So basically, right around the time of the Enlightenment, philosophers, like people starting with Mary Wollstonecraft and then jump forward 100 years, we get people like John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, they took these ideas that were very much sort of in the air about the equality of all human beings, right? This is where we sort of see, in some ways, some of the major defenses of and articulations of the political ideals that undergird basically all contemporary democracies, right? The idea that all human beings are created equal, or all men are created equal, as we see here in America, right? And so the argument that we saw from these early feminists was that the same thing that made all men equal was something that was shared by all women, and that was the idea that everyone has equal rational capacities, everyone has equal ability to set their own life plans, to figure out what they want, to figure out how they want to pursue happiness, whatever it is, or we see different articulations of this in the formation documents of different countries. But again, the basic idea is that the reason we shouldn't be living under like feudalism or aristocracy or these sorts of more hierarchical systems of social arrangement are because these different arrangements act as if some people are better than others. And the Enlightenment was big on rejecting that idea. The Enlightenment told us that no, everyone's created equal. That means everyone should be treated equally as equal citizens. Right? And of course, we know that argument. So even we can look at it even in the development of the United States, right? So we said all men are created equal, but we didn't really mean all men, right? We meant white men, right? White men who could maybe afford to own property, right? So even but the all there kind of has an asterisk, right? And so I like to think of it in some ways of like the history of moral and political progress is a history of us getting better about actually meaning all when we say all, right? And that's definitely what first wave feminists thought, right? They thought that women are just as capable of having these rational capacities as men, and therefore they should be treated equally. And what that looked like concretely in terms of the goals and of the ultimate successes of the first wave was basic sort of civic political rights, things like suffrage, right, the right to vote, things like the right to own property, right? And so what we saw is that like rejection of laws like coverture, right? So under the law of coverture, a woman was actually considered to be the legal property and ward of her father, first her father and then her husband, right? So this meant that a married woman actually could not own property, right? It was just sort of like legally, civically incoherent for her own property because she wasn't a person under the law, right? So first wave feminists wanted to reject laws like that, and it did not happen overnight. It took hundreds of years really to sort of, and many of these laws that treated women as appropriately subject to the authority of first their fathers and then their husbands, they stayed on the books until like the 20th century, right? So these things like stuck around for a while. But feminists were successful, and we got a lot of really, really important advances for women across the world. And again, it's still happening, but we're making progress. So that's the first wave of feminism, right? Women got the right to vote, women got the right to own property. My cat is trying to Zoom bomb right now. You guys want to see my cat? Because if I don't pick her up, she's just gonna. So what I need to do is just harass her for a little bit. She's gonna get real mad and then she'll leave me alone. So this is Dinah. She's really enjoying life under Zoom. Okay. Hopefully she'll leave me alone now. I've learned this from teaching that the only way to get her to leave me alone is to just like let her, and then hopefully she'll leave me alone. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. She's obviously a feminist, so it's okay. Okay, so that was the first wave of feminism. And then basically, so what we did is we saw women's life prospects really improve in some ways under the first wave of feminism, especially when it came to certain women, right? So middle-class women, white women, cis women, able-bodied women, straight women, these women really were able to reap a lot of the benefits of the first wave of feminism. Women could participate in professions, have careers, these sorts of things. And that was all well and good, right? But then, flash forward to like the middle of the last century, like around 1950 or so, sort of like, like post-war, post-World War II. And women really weren't still doing as well as men, right? There were still all of these ways in which women weren't fully participating in the public sphere. They weren't flourishing as well as men. So one of the ways I like to define feminism, because it's a kind of, I have another Zoom bombing cat. I like that cat. Very good. So the way I like to define feminism is to say that you're a feminist if you, first of all, agree with the social scientists, the historians, the people whose job it is to sort of tell us how human life is going. Basically, the thought is that every metric that we have to evaluate quality of life, women don't do as well as men. Right, so whether it's political participation, whether it's health, whether it's wealth, whether it's ability to sort of like control your life, whatever it is, women don't do as well. Whether it's subjective reports of happiness, right? But like pick whatever measure you have to that you would use to measure how well a human life is going. And women historically and still to this day across the world don't do as well as men on those measures. Okay, so if you're a feminist, if you agree with the social scientists about this. But this fact, right? This is not up for debate in some ways, right? For a feminist, if you agree with this, and if you think that this is a bad thing, right, that can and should be changed, right? So, for example, if you think that women are just these sort of like subhuman or like second status or second quality citizens or sorts of creatures, then you might think, oh yeah, it's true, women don't do as well as men, but that's because they don't deserve to. They're just not as good as men, right? But if you don't want to reject, if you want to reject that premise, which obviously I hope you do want to reject it, then you're basically on board with feminism, right? You agree that women don't do as well as men, and you think that we can and should do something to change it, right? That this isn't inevitable, right? And this is pretty much all that feminists agree on. There's been a huge variety of disagreement amongst feminists throughout the years about why we should, or what the problems are, what the solutions are, all of it. Like there isn't a ton of feminist consensus here. So I want to give this kind of like this Big Ten definition of what feminism is. Right? And the third plank of this definition, I'll talk about in a minute, but I wanted to give you just these first two planks to explain why we see the rise of the second wave of feminism. Because basically second wave feminists realized that women were sort of gaining legal equality, right? But they still didn't seem to be equal. They still weren't doing as well. And again, they didn't want to think that we'll write this off as inevitable. So they had to look for something else to explain why it was that women weren't doing as well as men. And along comes Simone de Beauvoir. And Beauvoir in 1949 published The Second Sex in France. And she was an existentialist philosopher, and she argued that women were systematically disadvantaged, not just by all of these legal formal inequalities, but by all of this stuff that you can't necessarily legislate. Right? All of these sort of informal social norms, expectations, often implicit, often not like unconscious, right? These rules that govern interpersonal interactions, right? Again, they're not the kind of things that you can write a law about, but the kind of thing that can really affect whether someone, like how well someone does in the world. And so Beauvoir, by saying things like one is not born but becomes woman, she starts pointing to all of the ways that socialization can affect why women become the way they are, right? And it's funny because you read The Second Sex. I always have my students read The Second Sex, and they're like, I thought we were supposed to be reading a feminist thing this week. She hates women. right? And it's true, like the first time you read Beauvoir, you're like, oh my God, why is she shitting on women so much? Because she just insults women, like left, right, and center, right? And it's this really, really bizarre read at first. Until you realize she's not insulting individual women. She's not saying women are like this. She's saying women are made to be like this. Women are given very few options but to be like this because of these forces of socialization, right? So as an existentialist philosopher, she rejects the idea that women are like anything, right? This is what existentialists do, right? They say existence precedes essence, right? So what that means is that human beings are distinctive in that we don't have an essence, right? Like a dog has an essence, a cat has an essence, right? We don't, like cat's essence is like Zoom bombing and things, right? Where it's up to, for human beings, we choose for ourselves what our essence is. And that's distinctive of what makes us human, is this ability to decide for ourselves what values we're going to have, what kind of person we're going to be, what we're going to hold dear, what we're going to fight for, all of this. And so she uses existentialist philosophy for feminist purposes, right? So the first way we saw sort of like liberal, the ideals of the liberal Enlightenment influencing feminism. The beginning of the second wave was really kind of started by, in some ways, by this idea of existential. I mean, it's maybe overstating to say that it comes from existentialist philosophy, but it was definitely influenced by this existentialist ideal that that really points to all of the ways that people are either encouraged or forced or coerced or just kind of nudged into behaving in certain ways. And so Beauvoir really, so she wrote this huge book, The Second Sex, where she really just starts in earnest, really looking at the social forces and the way that women are socialized to into roles that are systematically inferior, right? That systematically make it harder for them to succeed in the world. And from that, the second wave really kind of took off. It took off through the 60s and 70s, and we saw a lot of feminist work where feminists really wanted to start evaluating in earnest the ways that social forces prevent women from doing as well as men, right? So any kind of differences that we see between men and women are to be explained by the forces of socialization, right? So sometimes people talk about this as the nature-nurture distinction, right? So the thought is that feminists after Beauvoir really thought it was all nurture. Like all of these differences between men and women were to be explained by socialization. Some later feminists call this the coat rack view of sex and gender, right? So the idea is that we have this sort of biologically given body, right? The body is just this like pre-political biological reality, and different cultures adorn the body, both like figuratively and literally, with different cultural garments, right? So with clothes, but then also just like characteristics and norms and expectations and social roles and these sorts of things. And so the thought is that, so gender is now the coat rack, or is the clothes that are layered onto the sex body that is a biological given. And this was the view amongst feminists right up through probably until like maybe the early 90s, right? This really was this was how feminists, for the most part, thought about sex and gender and the relationship between the sexes. Okay. Flash forward to 1992, the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, back in the day when confirmation hearings took more than 8 seconds, right? We saw there was, does anyone, I assume some people remember the debacle there, right? So Clarence Thomas was credibly accused of sexually harassing and assaulting Anita Hill, right? And the backlash, or like just the way that people tried to make sense of what was going on in this gave rise to the realization that we needed new feminist ways to analyze what was going on in culture. Because basically what we saw is Black feminists started saying, hey, listen, like a feminist analysis is really just a white feminist analysis. And so the white feminists are saying we should believe in Anita Hill, right? But the anti-racists were decrying, often the anti-racist movements, often led by men, were decrying the treatment of Thomas as racist, right? And so Black feminists pointed out that we needed new sort of categories, new theoretical ways to understand what was going on in a case like this. And this really gave rise to the third wave of feminism. And the third wave of feminism is basically the rejection that if we're going to be feminists, we need to stop pretending that all women are white. We need to stop pretending that all women are like the women who had been sort of steering the ship of the feminist movement, right? These women were white, they were privileged, they were able-bodied, they were cis, they were straight. They had the social power to make their demands be listened to. And so they were the ones who got to decide what feminists, what the priorities of the feminist movement was going to be, right? And it was only in the early 90s, so this took a long while before this really started to kind of pick up pace. And one of the major themes that I really spent a lot of time on in Think Like a Feminist is the idea that feminism has been way too slow to really, really take this seriously. And in some ways, that the history of the feminist movement is a history of racism. It's a history of classism. It's a history of privileged white women pretending to talk about all women and to present the concerns of all women, but really just talking about themselves, right? So we see this, for example, with Susan B. Anthony, an early advocate of suffrage in America, right? So she's got this line where she says, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I ever fight for the right for the vote for the Negro and not the woman." Right, because there was this historically we had this point where there was it became clear that it was going to be either African American men who got the right to vote or women who got the right to vote. And at first, these two suffrage movements were aligned, and then they split when it became clear that African American men were going to get the right to vote, but not American women, but not women. And what we saw then was a lot of just really egregiously racist rhetoric from first wave feminists. Sort of like really just sort of like insulting the idea that but I'm a rich white woman, why shouldn't I be able to vote? Look, you're even letting those farmhands vote, right? So we saw a lot of racism, we saw a lot of classism in the first wave of feminism. We saw it in the second wave as well, right? So Betty Friedan, who was a very, very famous second wave feminist, who was known for her book called The Feminine Mystique. And so Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique to speak to what she called the problem that has no name. And according to the problem that had no name was the problem that all of these rich white housewives who were living in the post-war era in America primarily, but in the West in general, like the very sort of economically prosperous time for the country and for the world, they were not finding the satisfaction in the social roles that were set up for them, right? So everyone's familiar with Rosie the Riveter, right? So in the Second World War, women were told, hey, you can do it, right? You can throw off these shackles of gender convention that tell you that women aren't fit for life out in the world, right? We can do it, women can do anything. And that was great, but then as soon as the war was over, these same women who Rosie the Riveter was telling them to go work in the factories, they were like, no, actually, we changed our mind. Really, you should be going back and you should be a housewife. And so many of these women of this generation really found themselves just really, really unfulfilled by the role of the housewife that was given to them. And so Friedan writes this book, The Feminine Mystique, that points this out, where she says, hey, you, all you bored housewives, it's not just you. Like, it's not just like there's a reason we're all like addicted to Valium or whatever it is, right? It's because there's this problem that has no name. It's not just you. It's all of us, right? So we see the rise of the feminist slogan that the personal is political. Right, the idea that we can analyze these what feel like individual experiences for us in a political way and see that there are actually commonalities among us. Right, we saw the rise of consciousness raising groups where women would get together and talk about the commonalities that they had in their experiences, and the thought was that this is an important part of feminist practice, sort of coming to understand all of the ways that sexist forces affected individual people. Right. And that was great, right? But the problem is that Betty Friedan didn't stop to consider that maybe things were not great for a bored leisure class housewife, but things were almost certainly worse for the poor woman of color that she was underpaying to take care of her kids and her house and undo all of that unfulfilling domestic work, right? So it took the third wave of feminism for us to start realizing that when we talk about women, we need to not just be talking about women who are rich enough to get and well-connected enough to get college degrees and to write books and to read books, right? That if we're going to be claiming to talk about women, we need to be talking about all women. And that's where the third wave. So third wave feminism is this kind of, is in some ways a kind of reflective moment within the feminist movement where we actually try to be really, really careful both to correct these, to be honest about these historical mistakes, to correct them, and to actually be inclusive in our feminist projects, right? So, for example, Betty Friedan, on the other hand, not only was she sort of blind to the racism in her work, she was also explicitly homophobic, for example, right? So she was the first president of NOW, the National Organization of Women, and she went on the record as wanting to distance the feminist movement from lesbian women, right? So she called them the lavender menace. So she scared up this lavender menace just to disassociate the feminist movement from lesbian women, because she said that, oh, this is not a coalition we want, because too many people aren't taking feminists seriously already because they want to write us off as just a bunch of lesbians who need to get laid. If we let the lesbians into our movement, that'll just confirm it. So we have to distance ourselves from these women, right? So the feminist movement wasn't for women like them, right? And again, this is just straight up homophobia. It's unconscionable, right? There's simply no excuse for it. So yeah, that's one of the things. So it's in thinking like a feminist. One of the things I really, really emphasize in this book is that we actually have to be really sure that we're not just trying to think like privileged women, but actually thinking for all women. And again, the history of the feminist movement has been really bad on this. One of the most helpful metaphors we get from early third wave feminism is the idea of intersectionality. This comes from the feminist and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. And Kimberly Crenshaw came up with the idea of intersectionality to explain why we can't think of the harms that women experience as being kind of monolithic, right? So she says, like, think about like if there's an accident at a traffic intersection. So I don't know, I don't think you have as many of these rotaries in upstate New York as I do here in Boston. But in Boston, we have these insane traffic rotaries where they're just like they're moving up, like they're like 4 lanes wide, and everyone's moving really, really quickly, and it's kind of terrifying to drive through these things, right? And Massachusetts drivers are notoriously assholes, so it's problematic, right? So just imagine you're at one of these rotaries, right? And there's an accident that happens, and you're trying to reconstruct how that accident happened. It can be actually really difficult, maybe even impossible, because you just got stuff coming at you from every different direction, right? Whereas compare that to a traffic accident at like a really simple intersection that's just like, a 4-way stop, and there's an accident there. It's going to be a lot easier to reconstruct that accident at the 4-way stop because there's just not that much happening, right? So Crenshaw says that we should think about the experiences of oppression that people have as being, using this traffic metaphor, right? So if you're someone like me, someone who is white, who is cis, right, who is middle class, who is not disabled, right, who passes as straight, right? Someone like me, I experience oppression because I'm a woman, right? But I'm actually privileged along a lot of other axes, right? Whereas someone like, and so true for Betty Friedan, right? Whereas someone like Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a woman and also Black, right? She's going to experience oppression not just because she's a woman, but also because she's a person of color. And her point here is that the oppression that she experiences isn't like, it's not like you can like draw a Venn diagram and have like, all right, so here's all the oppressions that women experience, and here's all the oppressions that people of color experience, and whatever that sort of overlapping thing in the middle, that's the experiences of oppression that women of color are going to experience. No, that's not how you're supposed to think about it, according to Crenshaw, right? Rather, we should think about these things as, so she said that would be thinking about oppression as like additive, right? Where we sort of add on these different harms or injustices. And she says that if you actually talk to women of color, that is not the experience, right? If you actually look at the Anita Hill case, that is not the experience, right? That when you're a person who's oppressed on multiple axes, you're actually going to experience oppression that's not just worse, but also just completely different in some ways than the experience of someone who is oppressed on fewer axes. So that and that's one of the many sort of lessons we get from the third wave of feminism, the idea being that we need to actually be really epistemically humble in making claims about what if there's any kind of shared commonality among women, because basically every time we try to do that, every time we try to say, all right, this is the female experience and these are the harms that women are experiencing, and these are the solutions. Basically, if you look at the history of the feminist movement, every time we've done that, we've either consciously or unconsciously basically just said, what it is to be a woman is to be a woman like me. And the problems that women experience are the problems that I experience. And the solutions are to fix those problems, right? And what that looks like is a feminism that says, yeah, all we need is to sort of, get more female CEOs. All we need to do is just get more white women the privileges that white men have, and that's feminism. And that's the vision of feminism that third wave feminism, thankfully, has us reject, right? And instead, they say that we should be thinking about feminism in a much more inclusive way. And that is actually, it turns out, a lot harder than you might think. Okay. So we'll come back to that really common mistake in a minute, but first I want to shift a little bit and talk about some misconceptions of feminism, right? Some of the stereotypes, right? The first thing that pops into your head when you hear the F word, right? Do it for a minute. Just think. Just be honest with yourself, right? If this was a public, like if it was actually in the room, I would make you actually tell me these things, but I won't do that. Right? But just take like 30 seconds and just think to yourself, what's the first thing that pops into your head when you hear the word feminist, right? And be really honest. You can be honest because I'm not going to make you share it. Okay. All right. So whatever that is, my guess is that it's either one of two things. Okay. And you can tell me then maybe in the Q&A whether I'm right about this. Okay. So I suspect that when you hear the word feminism, you think either someone who is angry and like bitchy and opinionated and abrasive and ugly and unfeminine and just really, really unpleasant, right? She probably does body hair all wrong, right? She's got, like too much hair on her body and some weird Nike haircut. And she's probably wearing like flannel and plaid and weird Birkenstock boots. And, she's probably drinking her coffee out of a mug that says male tears, right? Because she hates men, right? I might or might not own that mug. But she's really, really angry, right? She's just pissed off all the time, right? She gets like, she can't take a joke. She gets like inexplicably furious when all you were trying to do was hold the door open for her, right? You can't figure out why she's so mad, right? Okay, so that's the first stereotype. And I'm going to actually read you a little chunk from this book where I talk about this stereotype in a little more detail. Okay, all right. So basically the thought here is the angry feminist, right, makes it 100% clear that she's judged you and your life choices and found them wanting. Right? So there's a really kind of judgmental sort of social justice warrior streak in this angry feminist, right? Okay, so I say this, I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see because I'm old. All right, so this stereotype of feminists is so aggressively unpleasant that it tends to put off men and women alike. Men are appalled by the specter of the angry feminist because they've been told it's their birthright to have women make their lives more pleasant. From mothers who kiss their scraped knees, to girlfriends who laugh at their jokes and submit to reenactments of degrading porn scripts, to secretaries who deliver coffee, to wives who pick up where their mothers left off and single-handedly shoulder the responsibility of making sure no one in the household runs out of clean underwear or dies of scurvy. Women's job is to make the world harmonious for men. Right? Think about all these social norms and social roles that second wave feminists have us criticizing. Right? So this is what second wave feminists criticize, the idea of like this is what women are for. Right? But if the whole point of women is to cater to men's needs and whims, then angry feminists are basically impossible to grok as women. Men hate these feminazis for calling into question centuries of unchallenged entitlement, for casting suspicion on the legitimacy of their red-blooded desires, for the unforgivable suggestion that traditionally gendered divisions of emotional and material labor are unfair. Because it refuses to play the man-pleasing game, angry feminism, which is abrasive, judgmental, unaccommodating, and unpleasant, angry feminism is dangerous. If the angry feminist can convince enough other women to join her, then the jig is up. Better to write her off, if at all possible, as a nasty woman who can't take a joke. Women, on the other hand, are horrified by angry feminists because our training in the care and feeding of men has been so thoroughgoing that we often don't see our servile behavior for what it is. We just know that we're deathly afraid of being taken for one of those harpies. Many women, speculates the radical feminist activist Andrea Dworkin, many women resist feminism because it is an agony to be fully conscious of the brutal misogyny which permeates culture, society, and all personal relationships. It's more fun to indulge the inconsistent and fickle delights permitted us by the norms of femininity than to admit that these norms exist primarily for the amusement and benefit of men. It's easier to fight other women over the scraps than to admit to ourselves that we are sometimes quite literally in bed with the enemy, that the men we love are implicated in, benefit from, and sustain the very world order that keeps us from living fully flourishing lives. It's safer to lie to ourselves than admit that when all is said and done, we serve at the pleasure of those we love. Okay, so that's the angry feminist, right? And as I go on to explain in the book, the reason this stereotype gets so much cultural uptake is because we don't have to take this person seriously. We can write her off and everything she says off as like the irrational wailings of an angry hag. Right, we're very, very good at not taking women seriously, right? Like think like Salem witch trials or whatever it is, right? That like a woman who is too emotional is just sort of is feeding into these ideas we have about why women aren't to be taken seriously, right? Ideals that first wave feminists were fighting against, right? The idea that women weren't as rational as men, right? But those ideas are still around and they still get a lot of cultural uptake, right? Like how many people refused to vote for Hillary Clinton because they were worried about, like World War III. happening when she was on her period or something, right? Women, we have this idea that women are sort of inherently embodied, inherently irrational, and inherently emotional, right? But what's weird is that the one emotion that we really don't permit women to have to express culturally is anger, right? So too for people of color, right? The one emotion that we really don't like seeing in Black people is anger, right? Think about the pushback to the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, right? So this point comes from the feminist theorist Bell Hooks, right? And so Hooks points out that right, it's no coincidence that we characterize these groups of people as being emotional, but the one emotion that we don't let them have is anger, and that's because anger is the one emotion that might actually get shit done. Right, anger can fuel like whole social movements, right? If it's allowed to be directed in the right way, right? But because that is so threatening to the status quo, we don't let women or people of color express anger, right? Instead, we write them off as not taken seriously, just precisely because they're expressing anger, right? When a white cis dude expresses anger, oh, that's just righteous indignation, right? He's just, he's just on the side of the good, right? Whereas when people not in these social categories express anger, they're treated with a lot more suspicion, right? And that's precisely because it's a way of writing them off. It's a way of not taking them seriously. So one of the things I talk about in Think Like a Feminist is how we really need to sort of have a reckoning with the way we treat women who are angry. And we really need to not let ourselves be shut down in the face of feminine anger, but instead ask ourselves, is this anger legitimate? Like, does this person actually have something to be pissed off about? Before we just think, oh, you're too angry, I can't handle this, right? And if we do that, then as many third-wave feminists point out, we start to see that actually, no, this anger is well-founded and it's pointing out injustices, right? This is legitimate anger. Okay. So yes, but again, I think it's no coincidence that stereotype of the angry feminist is something that pops into so many people's heads, right? Because again, it's just a way of not taking her seriously, right? But people who are actually much friendlier to feminism, people who themselves might even identify as feminists, are drawn to a different stereotype of feminism that is very different from angry feminism, but in some ways no less insidious, right? Because again, this stereotype is also very successful in managing to defang feminism of any kind of radical potential. Okay, so this is the second stereotype of feminism that I want to talk about, and that is here it is. This is the girl power feminist. Okay. The girl power feminist is sexy, feisty without being off-putting, and fundamentally unthreatening. She's confident without being pushy. She proclaims her independence, but promises not to do anything too radical with it. Girl power feminists are often professionally and financially successful. They lean in at work. They capitalize on the platitudes they've heard since childhood, assuring them that girls can do anything. They assume everyone else can do the same. Understanding women's empowerment as the success of individual women, not the collective betterment of all women, girl power feminism claims a victory every time a woman makes it in a man's world. Corporate women's leadership events are girl power feminism. Girls rule, boys drool is girl power feminism. Beyonce performing without pants in front of a giant screen and blazoned with the word feminist is girl power feminism. Beyonce in other manifestations is almost certainly more than this, it must be said. The Spice Girls practically invented the genre. Anyone who makes money selling an uncritical fantasy of a feel-good sisterhood is likely a girl power feminist. Anyone who makes money selling a conception of female beauty that congratulates itself on its inclusivity or diversity is probably a girl power feminist. Anyone who makes money hawking self-help platitudes that celebrate women's intuition and self-empowerment is in all likelihood a girl power feminist. This kinder, gentler feminism talks the talk of championing women's empowerment, but it does so without ruffling feathers, reassuring everyone that the status quo won't be interrupted in any significant way. Okay, so this is why the girl power feminist is so popular and so appealing, because she's not actually threatening. She's not actually going to do anything. Right. So I want to say that it's no coincidence that remember that statue that they put in front of the bull on Wall Street, sort of at the beginning of the Me Too movement. Her name was Fearless Girl. And it was a cool bronze statue of this really pissed off little girl, right? Who was just like facing down the bull on Wall Street. And everyone was like, oh, this is so wonderful. Yes, women, it's women's time, right? But it's no coincidence that statue was a girl, right? Because Fearless Girl, like she's not threatening. Like girls, like so we're perfectly happy to sort of encourage girls to be fearless. We love those narratives, right? We fancy ourselves feminists for it, right? We're much less interested in actually dealing with that fearlessness when it comes to us in the form of an adult woman, right? Then we're going to want to write her off as a bitch, right? As someone who is just unpleasant and abrasive and someone we don't want to deal with, right? Because an adult woman might actually be able to get things done, might actually be able to start changing the world, right? Whereas a girl, yeah, we want to we'll encourage them to be feisty, but by the time they're adult women, we really don't want to be dealing with their feistiness. So this is why the specter of girl power, another point about girl power feminism is that it's basically, it's a version of feminism that's been co-opted by people who are using it to sell stuff, right? And again, that's not going to change the status quo. That's just going to make rich people richer, right? So again, so if we understand that oppressions are all connected, if we think that racism is intertwined with sexism, and that sexism is intertwined with homophobia, and that all of them are intertwined with classism, we see that a feminism whose goal is just to get more kind of rich women even richer isn't a feminism that's actually going to change the world for all women, specifically not women at the margins who actually need the help. So that's why the stereotype gets the kind of uptake that it does. Real feminism, on the other hand, is much more varied, much more complex, much more diverse than any of this. And again, one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is a lot of the disagreements among feminists, and so it's important to sort of speak for all feminists when I do this. How am I doing for time? Because I did want to sort of talk through some of the sort of newer arguments that feminists have about trans inclusion, but maybe I can do it in the context of the Q&A.
Yeah, it might be good to open things up a little bit and see if people have questions.
Yeah, definitely.
So if anyone wants to, you can either just unmute yourself and ask, or go through the chat.
I can't read. I'm going to pull up the chat because I'm not reading it yet. Oh, here we go. Okay. Should I read this, or do you want to read it, Kat?
Oh, you can read it if
I can read it. Okay. Question 1. What is feminist view on Abrahamic religion? Don't these religions promote a submissive female role on the get-go? Creation myth. All right, and then question 2 is, how do I lead by example in my personal life? What feminist behavior do I express in my personal life that will make people follow in my footsteps? I mean, I'm just fabulous and everyone wants to know. Let me answer the first question first. Yeah, so actually I have a whole chunk in this book where I talk about the sort of traditional Abrahamic religious view of women. And I do think that according to at least the standard reading of the men and women and the appropriate relationship between them, that standard view is fairly regressive. It's regressive because it sets up women as sort of inherently inferior to men. And also, I think even possibly more problematically, it sets up the existence of two sexes as this sort of like natural innate thing, right? So I talk in the book about how the idea that men and women have sort of different essences, or just fundamentally different, is actually even older than these Abrahamic religions. Right? We see it back in the as far back as the ancient Greeks, right? So Aristotle famously said, like, if actually, maybe I'm going to see if I can dig this out really quickly. It's really cool. If you read Aristotle on the difference between men and women, you basically feel like you're reading like an incel subreddit. It's crazy. Yeah, I don't know if I can find it here really quickly, but it is just so good. Aristotle. Any more? Okay. All right, I wasn't going to read any more, but this quote is just too good to not read. Okay, so this is Aristotle on women. Right, so basically Aristotle thought that women were basically deformed men. Right, this was like cutting edge biology back in ancient Greece. Right, he thought women were just like basically men that hadn't developed properly. Right, so their ovaries were actually just these deformed testes that somehow kind of like shriveled inside their body. He also thought apparently that we had fewer teeth. So again, like, just count, dude. Like, that one's not hard, but yeah, apparently he felt women had fewer teeth, and that we had less of the vital heat that was sort of the animating force that made us alive. Right? And so we thought basically that men provided the form in reproduction, and women provided the matter. Right, so babies actually just come from men, but it's just that they just grow in women. Women just give them like the food that they need to turn into a baby. Right, just this super weird idea. I mean, but again, like, it's a long time ago. You know, they don't have microscopes and whatever, right? But listen to what he thinks about the differences between men and women's natures that arise because of this difference in vital heat. It's fascinating, right? So he says women are naturally less intelligent than men. They're more passive. They're more mischievous, less simple, more impulsive, more compassionate, more easily moved to tears. more jealous, more querulous, more apt to scold and strike, more prone to despondency and less hopeful, more void of shame or self-respect, more false of speech, more deceptive of more retentive memory, and also more wakeful, more shrinking, and more difficult to rouse to action. Right? So this sounds like something that you could read on an incel subreddit, right? But it's Aristotle. Like, these ideas have been around for a really long time. And basically what we saw is the Abrahamic religions pick up this idea, right, that men and women are sort of inherently different and that there's a hierarchy built into it. And they just entrenched that hierarchy that was already kind of existing previously in the work of other thinkers, right? And so again, we get the creation story, right, where we get the idea that Adam, is created, right, as the steward to take care of all of the other creatures, right? But then Adam decides he's lonely, and so God says, "All right, I'm gonna make you a friend, right? I made you out of my breath, right? I blew air into you." So Adam is actually created from God, right? But Eve is created from Adam's rib. Actually, they're not even named yet until they actually leave the garden. They're just known as man and woman. So man is all alone, and then woman is created out of his rib, right? So he's sort of one step removed from God, right? And they're hanging out in the Garden of Eden, and they're having lots of fun, right? And then until the woman decides that she's going to talk to the snake, right? And the snake, there's a reason that the snake goes to the woman, right? Because he knows that she's more gullible, right? She's more manipulable, right? Because there's this one tree that God said that you could have this whole garden, it's all yours, go nuts, but just don't touch this one tree. Don't touch the fruit of this one tree. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And so of course the snake's like, hey, what about that tree? And Adam would never touch it. So just go to Adam, he goes to Eve. Eve's like, yeah, what about that tree? Right? Why can't I have that? And so of course we all know what happens, right? She eats the apple, she convinces Adam to eat the apple, and then the jig's up, right? They're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and they are subject to a variety of punishments for disobeying the will of God. Right?
I just want to mention that there's a number of questions now in the chat, so I want to make sure we have time for all.
Oh my God! Okay, all right. So I will speed up. I could go on forever. Actually, I can just tell you, read this section from like 75 onward in the book, and I go on at length about the differences. Basically, what I say is that I do think that, I don't know, like I've got a lot of friends who are like progressive theologians. They're like, no, this isn't the only reading. I'm like, I know it's not the only reading, but let's not pretend it's not the reading that has the most cultural uptake. It's the reading that has so much influence in our society. So yes, I do think that the Abrahamic religions are in part responsible for ideas about what men and women are like that are problematic from a feminist point of view. But I also do take it that some progressive theologians have views that are a little more friendly to feminism. Okay, so let me just, there are a lot of questions here.
Is it helpful if I say them?
Yeah, so Kathy, can you just pick ones that you think are especially, because I'm worried that I'm going to like jump all around. So why don't you
Yeah, so
thank you.
There's a question here about the Me Too movement and how it's impacted feminism. So
yeah, absolutely. I could definitely talk about the Me Too movement. Yeah, so I think the Me Too movement was in some ways like what we see is like a recapitulation of second wave consciousness raising, right? We see a bunch of women talking to each other and realizing, hey, this isn't just something that just happened to me. This happens to lots of people, right? So again, it's this idea that these individual actions are actually happening to a lot of people. So it's not just a personal thing; it's a political thing. And I think the Me Too movement is, in some ways, really exciting. I think, again, we have to be careful to have our third wave intersectional glasses on when we participate in the Me Too movement. And we have to realize again that the Me Too movement wasn't invented by Alyssa Milano, the white actress, right? It was invented 10 years earlier by Tarana Burke, a woman of color who was working with sexual assault victims, right? And but I do think that the Me Too movement is a really exciting moment for women to start, airing a lot of dirty laundry, right? To sort of start being really, really explicit about the experiences that they share. And it does make me encouraged in some ways to think, I think that we see that there's certain things are not socially acceptable anymore. I mean, I worry a bit that the movement has had a bit of its momentum taken away by the pandemic, for example. But in some ways, maybe that's a good thing, right? Because I guess it's just a lot harder to be sexually harassed when we're all at home in our pajamas, right? Some of this, but I do think that the Me Too movement is something that, in some ways, what it is, it's the ideas of feminists kind of like bubbling up into the mainstream in ways that we hadn't seen in maybe even a generation. So I think in some ways this is our generation's moment to really start taking seriously stuff that feminists have been saying for like hundreds of years. Yeah.
And then the next question here is about transgender people and why they're not welcome into the feminist movement. So,
sure, yes. So I mean, I should say that they definitely are, just by not by all feminists, right? So there are some feminists who are known as TERFs, which is an acronym that stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminism. And TERFs think that trans women are not women. Probably the most famous TERF that you've heard of is J.K. Rowling, right? So J.K. Rowling is a big proponent of what's often called the bathroom wars, where she says, no, like trans women aren't women, and the reason we shouldn't pretend as if they're women is because then trans women will come into a public bathroom and that makes it not safe for cis women. Never mind that this is a crime that literally does not happen, right? So apparently in the US last year, apparently in the US there is on average one reported case of a man dressing up like a woman to assault a woman in a public bathroom. And there are literally hundreds of cases of just regular cis men just assaulting women in public bathrooms, right? To happen. So it's a crime that literally doesn't happen. There are crimes that are visited on trans women all the time. Trans women are actually even more likely to experience sexual assault and harassment than cis women. So there are women who should be concerned about in wanting to be able to use public bathrooms, but they're not cis women. Cis women are perfectly safe using public bathrooms, right? But TERFs like J.K. Rowling say, no, there's a problem with trans women aren't really women. They're just men who are using their social privilege to sort of derail the feminist movement, right? So there was a famous exchange between Germaine Greer, who was a sort of famous second wave feminist, who got really mad when Glamour magazine crowned Caitlyn Jenner the Woman of the Year. I think this was probably 3 years ago at this point, right? So Caitlyn Jenner is a trans woman, right? One of the Kardashians. And Germaine Greer got really pissed off, and she's like, what the hell? Like Glamour is saying that like with enough makeup and plastic surgery, like someone who's born a man can be a better woman than someone like me, who's a real woman born a woman. And she's really upset about this, because then when Caitlyn Jenner, as part of her acceptance speech for this Woman of the Year award, she's asked, what's the hardest thing about being a woman? You know what she says, Caitlyn Jenner? Caitlyn Jenner says, the hardest thing about being a woman is figuring out what to wear. And you're like, shut up, Caitlyn Jenner, right? So of course, like Germaine Greer is angry at Caitlyn Jenner, because Germaine Greer is a feminist who spent her entire life being very critical of this idea of femininity where women exist to just be looked at, to just be arm candy for men, right? And then suddenly Caitlyn Jenner comes along and gets all of these accolades for just trumpeting these really regressive stereotypes about what women are supposed to be like. Of course, Germaine Greer is mad at Caitlyn Jenner. I'm mad at Caitlyn Jenner too, right? But I'm not saying Caitlyn Jenner isn't a woman. I'm saying Caitlyn Jenner is saying dumb stuff, right? Caitlyn Jenner is not a feminist. She's not. She's a conservative. She's a Republican, straight up, right? Right. So Caitlyn Jenner is, but had unfortunately become, at least a couple of years ago, she was sort of like she become this like darling of the trans the trans movement. So she was sort of seen as like the spokesperson. She was a really famous trans woman, and she's saying all of this really regressive stuff. And so TERFs like Germaine Greer say this is what all trans women are like. This is like, if we let these women into the feminist movement, we're going to be going back like 100 years in our progress, right? Because their idea of what it is to be a woman is just all of these really retrograde stereotypes that we as feminists have been really fighting against. And so what I and other trans inclusive feminists want to point out is that, hey, Germaine Greer, maybe you should talk to more than one trans woman. Because if you actually talk to trans women, you'll find out that they're just as mad at Caitlyn Jenner as the rest of us. And they have a ton of there are a lot of sort of gender presentations that they have that don't just affirm these regressive stereotypes about what it means to be a woman. And furthermore, Germaine Greer and any other TERF, if you think that the problem with Caitlyn Jenner is that she's affirming these stereotypes of femininity that don't fit with your version of feminism, then why aren't you going after people like me? right? Because I'm like, look at me, right? You're all looking at me, right? Like I just look like, I'm just a regular cis woman, right? I'm not presenting in any way that's challenging your conception of gender. Like I put makeup on, y'all, right? I might be wearing pajama pants, but you don't know that, right? Right. But why is so? But if Germaine Greer's concern with Caitlyn Jenner is that she's sort of like sort of endorsing this really regressive version of femininity, then why isn't she also going after a cis woman like me? Right? She's not. And so the point here is that trans inclusive feminists like me, and I have a lot more arguments in the book that sort of back this up. They understand that what it is to be a woman is vastly more complex than just performing, or rather, actually, no, I want to make sure I say this properly. And I know I'm going on and we're not going to get to the other questions, so maybe I should stop. But yeah, Kathy, go ahead. Do you want to stop?
Well, there is a question Johannes had asked to say his question out loud.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Oh, awesome. So I love hearing this. I have a question. I'll give you the background briefly for it. The question is there not a certain, I'm going to call it a political experience that's relatively universal? And this is me, a cis straight male from the West, professional, blah, blah, so fully in a seat of privilege. Anyway, yeah. Is there not a political experience that's almost universal where one point in the constellation I see is Hillary Clinton running against Barack Obama, and Gloria Steinem wrote a fantastic op-ed in 2008 and said, it's no longer a big deal for a black man to run for president. It's still a big deal for a woman to run for president. Yeah. As a comment on the relative degree of social evolution for racial equal rights versus women's rights. My political time is from the late 70s and early 80s, where at home we had Ed Meese and Phyllis Schlafly, never mind Anita Bryant. And overseas we had nuclear warning shots and very traditional patriarchal war making. And if I look at the continuum of political experience, right, political analysis has gone out of fashion. There's a lot of social analysis and critical theory and blah, blah, but just the straight up politics that you get hit over the head with when you hear about female genital mutilation or women being treated basically the same as other breeding livestock. And I forgive me for saying it that way, but I say it that way intentionally, in certain other cultures, right? Those are old tribal structures of control, which, as I say, they treat women as just another form of chattel, livestock. Is that not, it's not allowed to manifest in its worst form usually here. Me Too, to me, is a commentary that says, we ain't that far away. Yeah. We have not come a long way, baby, and civilization is a very thin veneer, and those are the same behaviors. Is that not really I pose the question to you, is this not really a universal political structure which is the origin of what I propose, or what seems to me is a universal political problem for women and for men too? We suffer because people we care about get their lives messed up by this nonsense.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's a nice articulation of a commonality. And I think what's nice about it is that it's actually the way you stated it. It was stated in a way that is quite broad, right? Because if you actually try to get more specific than that, if you try to get more specific and say, no, these are the shared experiences that all women have, you're going to start leaving women out left, right, and center, right? But I think you're right if you sort of talk about like sort of just and again, and I talk in the book at length about this, about feminist attempts to sort of discuss what it means to be a woman. So Sally Haslinger is probably one of my favorite feminist philosophers, has this idea of gender is sort of inherently hierarchical. So like just basically what it is to be a woman is to be someone who is subject to the social control of men. And what it is to be a man is to be appropriately capable of wielding that social power. Like that's just the very definition of the sexes. But notice that if we have those definitions, then back to the trans issue, trans women are obviously women, right? Trans women are obviously subject to these same forces just as much as cis women, right?
Almost by choice.
Not by choice.
Not by okay, right. Right. But are they not choosing that constellation, and the bad parts are part of the constellation that they are choosing to move themselves towards? Is that a reasonable way to look at it?
No, I don't think choice is necessarily a useful way to think about this. At least no more than the question of like whether you choose to identify as a man and whether you choose to live as I'm assuming that you're a cis man just from looking at you, right? Yeah. So your experience of gender is not experienced by you as a choice, I assume.
True, but so, not to take this off into the weeds and take time, but it's to me it's a question of degree. I can choose which presentations to engage in and which ones to reject among the good and the bad and the nonsense that's prescribed by orthodoxy.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, and that option is open to everyone. That's right. Yeah. So one of the things I talk about in the book, I'll be very quick here, is that I talk about how it's actually really, really hard to define what it is to be a woman and what it is to be a man. Because again, one of the lessons of intersectionality is that so many attempts to define the sexes end up leaving people out, and the people who often get left are the people at the margins. But I think philosophically, probably the most fruitful way to go is to go Wittgensteinian, right? So to think of gender as a family resemblance concept. Right. So what it is to be a woman is to sort of have a cluster of traits, not necessary and sufficient conditions. Right. The thought is that if you satisfy some of these, all of these traits, then you're obviously a woman. If you satisfy some, but not all, then you're probably still a woman. And what we should be doing is deferring to your sincere identification. Right. If you satisfy none of them, well, then you're not a woman. Right. So the thought here is that the family resemblance way of thinking about the concept of womanhood is probably the most helpful. But I expand on that a lot in the book as well.
All right, everyone. Unfortunately, we are pretty much out of time.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
This went quickly.
There are still some more questions, and I apologize to those that we didn't get to. But I do really encourage you all to check out Dr. Hayes' book. It's really a fabulous read. And thank you so much for this, thought-provoking talk that has clearly left people with lots of new ideas and questions that they're curious about. So
excellent. Thank you very much for having me.
All right.
Okay. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.